For some time I have said, including times on this floor, that the choice between a clean environment, clean air, clean water, and a strong economy is a false one. Some people say you can't have a cleaner environment and have a stronger economy at the same time. I just don't think that's correct. And the Toxic Substance Control Act, Toxic Substance Control Act is an acronym for everything, but we affectionately call the Toxic Substance Control Act TSCA, TSCA. But the TSCA reform legislation that we approved in this body, on this floor, last night is proof of the fact that we can have a cleaner environment, safer environment, a healthier environment, and a stronger economy. They go together. And maybe when I finish my remarks, Mr. President, folks will understand why that might be true. But every day in this country, manufacturers use a variety of chemicals. I'm told there are tens of thousands of chemicals on this planet, in the air, in the ground, in the water, in our bodies, tens of thousands in all, that manufacturers use to make everything from carpets, like the carpet that we're standing on, to cosmetics, to water bottles, to dishwashing soap. And the Toxic Substance Control Act of 1976, which former President Gerald Ford signed and said it was like landmark legislation. He said this is huge legislation. And in terms of protecting the environment and public health. But he said it was intended to give EPA the authority to monitor and to test chemicals, to regulate the ones that pose a risk to human health or to the environment. That was the deal. But over the past 4 decades, since Gerald Ford signed that law into law, the Toxic Substance Control Act has never worked as intended. Never worked as intended, leaving the public at risk for toxic exposures, and the private sector with a broken regulatory process that has undermined innovation, and frankly led to a lot of uncertainty and lack of predictability. As a recovering governor, I know that among the things that we need to have a better, and more nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation, is businesses, whether they're large or small, they need predictability, they need certainty. And when the federally passed and enacted 40 years old law, the Toxic Substance Control Act, did not provide that predictability and certainty. In fact, for the last 40 years, I think something like EPA has fully vetted 6 toxic substances. Imagine that. In 40 years, 6. In the last 20 or 25 years, none. And in the meantime, what's happened is states have stood up and said, well, we'll do this. If the federal government's not going to do it, we'll do it. And now what we have is a patchwork quilt of state requirements. We have businesses, not just chemical businesses, but a variety of businesses in this country that are trying to comply with the laws in dozens of states. And when the federal standard that we set 40 years ago just doesn't work, just does not work. So for a while, the Toxic Substance Control Act has been broken. That's a polite way of saying it. But over the past 39 years, we've learned a lot more about toxic chemicals. We've learned about the cause, how they can cause harm to our environment. They can cause harm to public health. And we've also learned how best to identify and protect against these risks. More than 3 years ago, 2 of my colleagues, one a Democrat, Tom Udall, New Mexico, the other Republican, Dave Vitter, Louisiana, they wrote something called the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. Frank Lautenberg, for many years, a senator from New Jersey, whose birthday I remember still to this day. He's now deceased, but his birthday, January 23rd. And the reason why I remember that is that's when my birthday is. And this is an issue that we've actually shared a strong interest in doing something about. My recollection, it's hard to remember because people move around here from desk to desk, but I think his seat was right here, back behind where I'm standing to today. But my colleagues Tom Udall and David Vitter wrote a bill and named it after Frank Lautenberg because this is an issue he cared a lot about. He also tried, not once, but several times, to write legislation that could be enacted to take that 40-year-old Toxic Substance Control Act from 1976 and sort of bring it into the 21st century and help it become effective and to make sense for the digital age. But the bill written by Senators Udall and Vitter reforms the old Toxic Substance Control Act, and it does it in ways to better protect the public, to protect us, our families, our businesses, and so forth. It is also designed to create a more manageable regulatory framework for American businesses and innovators, so they have some predictability and certainty with what they're dealing with. Whether they happen to be doing business in Delaware, or they're Maryland, or Virginia, or Wyoming, or Idaho, or California, they'd have some certainties of what the rules of the road were going to be for the toxic substance or the chemicals that they might be using in their processes. Well, after the bill was introduced by Senators Vitter and Udall, I worked closely with both of them for more than a year as a member of in our Environment and Public Works Committee. We led a number of meetings, discussions, and we're always focused on securing enhanced protections for public health and environment while providing certainty and predictability for American businesses. I focused especially on language to secure provisions that would protect children, that would protect pregnant women, and protect workers from toxic risks. The provisions that I especially focused on include ensuring that the EPA has access to information in order for them to assess safety risks. And the third area that I looked at was something to allow states to enforce federal toxic safety. If the EPA wasn't doing their job, could it be a state backstop in a way that made sense? I think that's not an unreasonable thing to ask to do. We did that in Dodd-Frank with respect to nationally chartered banks. If the Office of Control of the Currency and nationally chartered banks is not making sure consumers are being looked after, then we allowed state attorney generals not to write their own regulations, their own laws, but to enforce federal standards and laws. So I want to make sure that in the event that someday we had an EPA that wasn't interested, frankly, in enforcing a new version of the Toxic Substance Control Act, that states could step in and enforce it for them. Chemical manufacturers and consumers alike deserve legal clarity, a timely review process, and the ability to trust that products that people use every day are safe. And I might add, Mr. President, Senator Udall, Senator Vitter introduced legislation. He started gathering co-sponsors. My guess is that our presiding officer, and I don't mean to be presumptuous, but my guess our presiding officer probably ended up as a co-sponsor. At the end of the day, we had 30 Democrats and 30 Republicans. And the idea was to add a Democrat, add a Republican, add a Democrat, add a Republican. It's a little bit like how a bill is made, or should be made. It's almost a textbook example of how legislation could be formed, should be formed, even on a difficult, contentious issue like the one I'm talking about today. I got involved, I've been involved already from the very initial efforts to rewrite the Toxic Substance Control Act, involved with David Vitter and Tom Udall, and also the chairman of our committee, Jim Inhofe. But I got to a point where I said to the two co-authors of the legislation, they were looking for co-sponsors, and I said, I'd be willing to co-sponsor your bill, your version of the rewrite of the Toxic Substance Control Act, but there are like 10 changes I'd like for you to consider making. And they said, what are they? And I said, well, here, I got some idea what they are. And then they said, well, put them in writing, put that in writing. So I put them in writing in a letter to Senator Vitter, Senator Udall, and I said, these are 10 changes I'd like to see made in the bill that you've introduced. And if you'll make these changes and agree to these changes, I'll co-sponsor your bill. And not only will I co-sponsor your bill, but so will about 10 or 11 other Democrats. And we all signed the letter. This is probably about a year and a half ago. And to their credit, and the letter was more to Senator Vitter than to Senator Udall, and I think it went to both. But to his credit, Senator Vitter and his staff went through piece by piece, proposal by proposal, all 10 or 12 of them, 10 of them, I think. And at the end of the day, they agreed effectively, essentially, with all of them. And they said, we will incorporate all 10 of your proposals in the bill and rewrite the bill. And now will you co-sponsor the bill? I said, yes, I will. And so did the rest of us who signed that letter, all 10 of us. I also said, when I said I'll co-sponsor the bill, I said there's 3 areas that I think still need some work. 3 areas that still need some work. And my passion for pushing for this legislation will be tempered somewhat by your willingness to also act in subsequent changes to the bill in these 3 areas. I won't go into those 3 areas later. But I will say later on, a couple of my colleagues, Cory Booker, let's see, we had, I think, Sheldon Whitehouse, maybe Jeff Merkley, Ed Markey. I mean, they sort of stepped up and said, we're interested in those 3 areas, and we want to see further changes made in the bill. And with those changes, we added even more co-sponsors, and finally we ended up with like 60, and said, let's take that bill to the Senate. Report out of committee, and eventually worked it through the Senate. Not easy, but finally got it done. Went to conference with the House, and lo and behold, we have a conference report, which we passed unanimously here last night by unanimous consent. I mean, nobody objected. Consider how controversial this bill's been for years. That is amazing. And at a press conference we held today with some of the principal Democrats, Republicans, Senate, and one of our House members came over. Tom Udall said, Senator Udall said, he talked about how he felt elated to be able to pass such a contentious bill after all these years unanimously. And he likened it to like standing at a mountaintop. Standing at a mountaintop, he's a mountain climber. He's from New Mexico. They have some real tall mountains. He said, it's like standing at a mountaintop. He said, I feel elation when I climb a tall mountain and stand at the top of the mountain. And he said this morning at the press conference, he felt elation as well. And then when I spoke right after Senator Udall, I said in Delaware, we don't have mountains. Delaware is the lowest lying state in America. We really worry about climate change and sea level rise. For us, it's not just some theory, it's something we worry about. So the highest point of land in Delaware is a bridge. And every now and then, if I want to get really high and climbing something, I can climb the bridge, but it's not really that high. And but the thing that gives me elation in Delaware is when I was governor and before that, state treasurer and all, the thing that gave me a great elation in my state is when we all work together. And Delaware has a tradition, we call it the Delaware Way, where Democrats and Republicans work together, set aside their partisan differences, and just say, what's the right thing to do? We in Delaware, it's a small state, you can get pretty much the key stakeholders into a room and work out a lot of our differences within a couple of hours. Pretty amazing how it works sometimes. And I share with my colleagues today an African proverb. Mr. President, you probably heard this one before. You probably used this one before, but it goes something like this. If you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. Let me just say that again. If you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. And that's especially true in the Senate. And then to get anything done of any consequence, you need 60 votes. We already have about 55 Republicans, roughly 45 Democrats, maybe an independent in there somewhere. And so we've got to figure out how to travel together. And we have been traveling a long ways over the last 4 years or so, but we finally gotten to our destination. And I think we've gotten to a very good outcome in terms of the policy that we've adopted. But for the first time, the legislation that has been agreed to by the House and the Senate is going to be sent now to the President. We require that every chemical used in consumer products is assessed for safety. I'll say that again. Every chemical used in consumer products is assessed for safety. At the same time, our legislation will offer businesses a predictable and a manageable regulatory framework, not a whole bunch of different regulatory frameworks, but one, for chemicals that do not pose a safety hazard. We've been struggling and negotiating this bill in the Senate, as I said, for a long time, maybe as much as half a dozen years. Been a lot of give and take by both sides of the aisle to get us to where we are last night and today. And we are where we are today because both sides have worked together to compromise on policy without compromising on our principles. Right behind me, I mentioned Frank Lautenberg used to, I think, sit at one of these desks behind me. So did Ted Kennedy. And I'll never forget when I was fairly new in the Senate going and having a lunch with him. I wasn't sure that we had the kind of interpersonal relationship that I wanted. And this place works, his presiding officer knows a lot on relationships. And I said to him, I said, maybe someday I could just come to your office and We just sit and talk with you for a while, have a cup of coffee. And he said, why don't you come to my hideaway and we'll have lunch together? I said, really? And he said, yeah. And in a week or two, we went to his hideaway and we had lunch together. And his hideaway was just an amazing place. It's almost like a museum in terms of all things about the Kennedy family and his brothers and his own life. It was an amazing place. And among the things that we talked about that day were his ability to find compromise and consensus with one of our current colleagues, a guy named Mike Enzi, a wonderful guy named Mike Enzi, who presiding officer knows is one of the two senators from Wyoming, former mayor of Gillette, accountant, I think maybe a CPA. And once when I was presiding over the Senate years ago, I remember Mike Enzi coming to the floor, getting recognized and speaking and talking, and he started talking about the 80-20 rule and how the 80-20 rule allowed the folks he served on, he was a senior Republican on a committee called Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. Ted Kennedy was a senior Democrat on the Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor Committee. And it was an incredibly productive committee. Incredibly productive committee. All kinds of bipartisan legislation coming out of it. And I asked later on that day, I said to Senator Enzi off the floor, I said, how do you and Ted Kennedy manage to get so much done in the Senate Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee? How do you do that? And he says, it's the 80-20 rule. And I said, what is that? And he said, Ted Kennedy and I agree on about 80% of the stuff. We disagree on maybe another 20%. And what we do is we focus on the 80% where we agree, and we set aside the other 20% to another day, and we'll figure that out some other time. And when I talked to Ted Kennedy about the same thing, he said, I'm always willing to compromise on policy and on process. He said, I just don't want to compromise on my principles, And he and Mike Enzi managed to have an incredibly productive partnership on that committee and here in the Senate. Senator Kennedy had a very similar kind of relationship with Orrin Hatch, who now chairs the Finance Committee, as we know. But we are where we are today because both Democrats and Republicans have worked together to compromise on policy without having to compromise our principles. And the final product is testament to a robust and a transparent committee process. I think it's a textbook example of how we ought to legislate around here. And if we can get something that difficult, that complex, that controversial behind us in, I think, an appropriate way, and get support of environmental groups, business groups, Democrats, Republicans, maybe there's some other things we can get done, and God knows we need to. So I'm proud of the work that we've done together to reach this historic agreement. And in addition to thanking Senators Udall and Senators Vitter and the chairman of our Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Jim Inhofe, I also want to say a special thank you to the members of our staff. I think those of us who serve or are privileged to serve as senators, we work hard. But on this issue, and some of us worked hard on this issue, but the folks who really worked hard on this issue were the members of our staff. And I'm not going to go through all the names of the folks who work for this senator and that senator, but I just want to say to those of you who know who you are, thank you. You've done great work, and you've enabled us to do the people's work. And I would say to a fellow who was a member of my staff for the last maybe 3 years, who worked really day and night on this legislation, a fellow named Colin Papard, who now works for the Los Angeles Transit Authority out on the West Coast. Just a special shout out to him, and a special thank you to him for all of his efforts.